given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family.
The palace had seen scandal before. It had weathered abdications, affairs, divorces, and the kind of grief that splits a nation clean in two. But on the morning that King Charles III summoned his closest family into a sealed chamber at Windsor, advisors surrendering their phones at the door, guards posted beyond the locked threshold, nobody inside those walls was prepared for what they were about to hear. Not William, not Anne, not Catherine, and certainly not Camilla, because the man who had spent the better part of 4 decades defending one woman against the fury of an entire country had just made a decision that would shake the British monarchy to its foundations. King Charles III had stripped Camilla of her future as queen, not through death, not through divorce, through a formal royal declaration, cold, permanent, and irreversible, that reduced the queen consort from the most powerful woman in the British royal household to a private figure living in the shadow of a crown she would never fully wear again. And the question that tore through Britain the moment that announcement landed wasn't just what Charles had done. It was why, and more importantly, what it means for everyone left standing. Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than a throne, a chair, and a broken marriage. This is about power, survival, loyalty, and the brutal truth that even the greatest love story in royal history couldn't outrun the demands of the crown. Make sure you're subscribed before we go any further, because this one changes everything. The sealed room. Let's set the scene, because the details here matter enormously. The gathering was officially called a constitutional briefing, a specific category of closed royal meeting used to resolve matters affecting royal authority at the highest level. That framing alone should tell you how serious this was. These meetings are not called for minor reshufflings or quiet administrative changes. Constitutional briefings exist to formalize decisions that restructure the monarchy itself. Senior members of the family had been summoned. William and Catherine arrived together. Princess Anne and Prince Edward took their places. Advisors who had served the palace for decades stood waiting in silence, and on the table, sealed folders, each bearing Camilla's name. Charles entered last. He lifted the declaration, and his fingers, according to those present, were trembling. Think about that for a moment. This is a man who has navigated public hatred, private grief, the death of his mother, and the weight of a crown placed on his head before the world's cameras. And this moment, made his hands shake. He announced that his wife, Queen Consort Camilla, would cease carrying out the duties and privileges attached to her position. She would no longer appear as the monarchy's leading female figure. She would live in a reduced, private role for the remainder of his reign. No review period, no temporary withdrawal, no path back to her former standing, just silence, sealed orders, and the sound of a dynasty rewriting itself in real time. William sat beside Catherine and watched his father struggle through every sentence. Catherine glanced toward her husband, already calculating what this meant for their own future. Anne remained perfectly still, but those who know her say she noticed something else. A second page beneath, her brother's hand, kept deliberately hidden, suggesting the declaration concealed something even more painful than the decision itself. And across the palace, in her private rooms, Camilla received the news from a courier. She gripped the arm of her chair. She asked, quietly, precisely, whether Charles had personally approved every word. The answer came back immediately. He had. How did it come to this? Now here's the question you need to sit with. How does a king strip his own wife of her future? This is not a man with a short memory. Charles III spent 30 years under public siege defending Camilla Parker Bowles. He weathered the fallout from the Diana years, the anger, the grief, the unprecedented global hostility directed at both of them. He waited. He rebuilt. He made Camilla his wife in 2005, when most observers thought the monarchy would never accept her. And when his mother died and the crown passed to him, Camilla became queen consort, one of the most remarkable reversals in modern royal history. She had survived everything the public threw at her. So what on earth changed? The answer, as Anne later explained to William in a private conversation, was not one argument, or one incident. It was a pattern, and that pattern reached its breaking point during a closed investiture planning ceremony at Windsor Castle. An investiture, for context, is a formal occasion where the monarch or a senior royal presents honors. They are governed by protocol, precedents, and, critically, sealed written instructions from the sovereign himself. Before this particular ceremony, Charles had left a sealed written instruction reserving the central ceremonial chair for Catherine, Princess of Wales. Camilla took it. She was already seated when Catherine arrived. An aide quietly approached and asked her to move. She refused, both hands on the armrests, chin up, not a word spoken, just presence, defiance, and a challenge so calculated it didn't need to raise its voice. Catherine stopped in the doorway. She said nothing either. William entered later, saw his wife standing aside from a chair that had been formally assigned to her, and felt, in his own words, according to palace accounts, anger rise through him like heat. But Catherine's silence warned him not to turn the insult into open war. Not there, not then, but the damage was already done. Charles confronted Camilla privately after the ceremony. He asked, simply, why she had ignored his instruction, and Camilla answered, in a response that was recorded in palace documentation, that she would not become invisible simply because the next generation was impatient. Charles didn't just hear defiance in that answer. He heard a warning. His marriage and his succession were now pulling in opposite directions, and as king, as sovereign, he could not allow that tension to continue unchallenged. The document, evidence. But here's where the story shifts from personal confrontation to something far more serious. Princess Anne had been watching, and Anne, meticulous, unyielding, constitutionally precise in a way that few in the royal family can match, had been compiling something. She handed her brother a documented folder. Inside, records of earlier royal instructions that had been altered, delayed, or quietly reinterpreted by members of Camilla's household. Staff who had rerouted. Ceremonial planning. Seating arrangements changed before anyone entered the room. Documentation showing that what happened at Windsor had not been a spontaneous act of pride. It had been coordinated. Someone had prepared the challenge before a single royal arrived. The replaced seating cards at Windsor weren't impulse, they were strategy. Charles summoned Camilla to his private study. No advisors, no couriers, no protection from ceremony or procedure, just the two of them, a desk and a seating plan with crossed-out names lying between them. He did not raise his voice. Those who observed him in the aftermath described his tone as something worse than angry, quiet, measured, and final. He placed the altered document on the desk and asked one question: had she authorized Catherine's name to be removed? Camilla admitted she had known the central chair was intended for Catherine. She argued, and in her own way, you can understand the desperation beneath that argument, that surrendering every visible sign of seniority would leave her queen in name only. She had fought too long to reach that position. She could feel the future slipping away beneath her. Charles answered with words she had never expected to hear from him. He told her that the throne had never been created to prove their love. He still loved her, but as sovereign, as the person carrying constitutional responsibility for the crown and the nation, he could not allow personal affection to override succession. He could not allow love to destabilize the very institution he had inherited and was bound to protect. Camilla reached up and removed a royal brooch from her coat. At state events, a royal brooch isn't decoration, it's a symbol of belonging and rank. She placed it beside the document and told him he could not ask her to wear symbols of power while denying her the power to use. Charles opened Anne's file and pointed to the documented unauthorized contact between Camilla's office and ceremonial planners. Camilla moved to deflect. She accused William's household of building a case against her, and Charles stopped her with 4 words that broke the last defense standing between them. His son hadn't made the recommendation, Charles had. The declaration. Camilla rose without asking for mercy. She left the brooch on the desk. She closed the door behind her. She did not look back. Charles sat alone in his study. He removed his glasses. He pressed his fingers against his eyes, and when the sound of her footsteps had disappeared entirely, he reached forward and pressed the private bell. When the constitutional secretary entered, the senior advisor, who whose role is to translate a monarch's decision into formal royal instruction, Charles ordered an irreversible declaration reducing Camilla's public role, effective immediately. The marriage remained legally intact. The crown could not erase that, but her public functions, her household authority, her ceremonial presentation, her access to royal privileges, all of it would be restructured and placed under the approval of the sovereign's central staff. A second instruction was signed, preventing reversal during illness, pressure, or any future withdrawal. Before he dismissed the room, Charles looked at William and said something that every future king would do well to remember. A future monarch must never confuse affection with constitutional responsibility. William heard it, and he understood it. Minutes later, Camilla's senior aide received an order to clear her office suite before sunset. The reality sets in. The first sign of Camilla's new reality wasn't a headline, it was silence. Her schedule emptied overnight. Briefing folders stopped arriving. Staff who had entered her rooms every morning were redirected without explanation. Invitations addressed to the Queen were reassigned or postponed. Her communications team was instructed to route every public statement through the Central Palace office, meaning that even her own words now required permission before reaching the outside world. When she walked into her office and found archival boxes already arranged beside the desk, she refused to touch them. Packing her own belongings would have meant accepting Charles's judgment. She wasn't ready to give him that. An aide began quietly removing framed photographs from the walls. When the woman reached a private portrait of Charles, Camilla crossed the room herself, took it from her hands, and held it against her chest. This is the detail that cuts through everything else. The man who had just dismantled her world was still the man whose photograph she couldn't let go. Then came the deeper wounds. Charities received formal letters informing them that Catherine, Anne, or Sophie might now represent the crown at future events. Several state ceremonies were restructured. At the next major national occasion, Camilla would not enter beside Charles. She would not enter at the ceremonial center at all. The humiliation would not be private. It would be made visible before the entire nation. That evening, Charles passed her half-cleared office without entering. Camilla saw his shadow beneath the door. She watched the handle. It didn't move. He sent no advisor that night, no formal communication. Only a handwritten note slipped beneath her door asking her to meet him in the small garden room at dawn. The reckoning at dawn. There were no uniforms outside the garden room, no secretaries, no family members positioned to intervene. Charles arrived first. Camilla entered, carrying the photograph she had refused to leave in the office. For the first time since the announcement, they weren't king and queen, sovereign and consort, or rival centers of influence. They were two people asking whether a love that had survived the world could survive the crown. Camilla placed the photograph on the table between them and asked the only question that mattered to her. Had he acted because she had embarrassed the monarchy, or because he no longer believed in her? Charles didn't retreat behind procedure. He told her he still loved her. But love, he explained, could not excuse actions that placed their private bond above the succession and the unity of the family. Catherine's rising position was not an attack on Camilla's history. It was a preparation for the monarchy's future, and that future had to be protected, regardless of what it cost him personally. Camilla listened, and then she did something Charles hadn't anticipated. She confessed. She told him that fear had driven her. She had endured years of hatred, public mockery, and rejection to earn a place beside him. Every step toward acceptance had been paid for in humiliation, and when Catherine's role began to expand, she hadn't felt institutional clarity. She had felt erasure. She had felt that everything she had survived was about to be undone, not by the public, but by the man she had sacrificed everything for. And in that confession, you could hear the whole story of Camilla Parker Bowles compressed into a single, devastating moment. She told Charles she would withdraw from ceremonial competition. She would stop contesting Catherine's future position. She asked for no reversal, no hidden promise of return. Charles answered with equal clarity. She would remain his wife. She would keep a protected private residence. Her personal dignity would be preserved, but her public role as queen would never be restored. Camilla removed the brooch. Somehow, in the hours since the study, she had recovered it and closed Charles's hand around it. She told him the crown should decide where it belonged. Neither smiled, but neither walked away. Britain reacts. By breakfast, the announcement had escaped the palace walls and detonated across the country. Television programs were interrupted. Newspaper presses rewrote their front pages. Radio bulletins carried the news into every kitchen and car and train carriage in Britain. And outside Buckingham Palace, something remarkable happened. People gathered in the rain and stood in silence. Not protest, not celebration. Silence. One major newspaper ran an empty ceremonial chair beneath a single headline. The Queen who stepped away. One image, no explanation needed, capturing the weight of what had just happened more powerfully than any editorial could. Commentators split almost immediately down two lines that Britain has walked before. One camp argued that this proved the monarchy could hold its own members accountable, that the crown operated by rules that applied even to those sleeping beside the king. The other argued that Charles had exposed a family conflict too raw and too private for public consumption, and that in doing so, he had damaged the institution he was trying to protect. Rind, former royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades, admitted on live television that nothing in their careers had prepared them for this moment. Some drew comparisons to the abdication crisis of 1936, another king forced to choose between personal love and institutional duty. Others pushed back on that comparison immediately, arguing this was something entirely different and far more modern. Not a king abandoning his throne for a woman, but a king dismantling his wife's future to protect one. When a broadcaster called Camilla the greatest personal sacrifice of his reign, Charles switched off the television. Camilla, honoring the promise she had made at dawn, refused every request for a statement. She understood, correctly, that one angry public response could transform a private surrender into open rebellion, and that silence, however painful, was the only thing preserving what remained of her dignity and her marriage. But silence also meant allowing strangers to define her legacy while she stood powerless to correct them. Ask yourself, could you do that? Could you watch the world argue about your life, your choices, your worth, and say nothing? Could you sit inside a palace and listen to your name being debated on every screen in the country, knowing that the one person who could defend you had chosen not to? William, Catherine, and the weight of what they gained. Here's the part of this story that the palace desperately hoped would go unexamined, because while Britain was focused on what Charles had taken from Camilla, there was another question sitting quietly in the middle of the room. Who benefited? The answer was Catherine. Several ceremonial responsibilities previously held by Camilla were transferred to the Princess of Wales almost immediately. Her first reassigned appearance, representing the crown at a national charity service that had been Camilla's, was announced before the week was out. William moved instantly to protect her from the optics. He instructed his team not to brief against anyone, not to celebrate, not to treat the transfer as a victory. He understood with cold precision that every responsibility Catherine now carried could be reframed by the press as proof that she had benefited from another woman's humiliation. Catherine herself went still when she opened the proposed schedule and saw her name beside ceremonies. Camilla had expected to lead. She told William she wanted no celebration of any kind. She understood that the public sympathy surrounding Camilla, and there was considerable public sympathy, could harden into suspicion against her if she appeared to have sought this outcome. She hadn't sought it, but history, as Catherine knows well, rarely cares about intent. The optics were unavoidable. Every camera pointed at her now carried a second unspoken frame, the ghost of the woman whose place she had inherited. Catherine would have to perform grace under a scrutiny few royals in modern history had ever faced, and she would have to do it while the nation was still deciding whether to grieve or celebrate what had just happened. The verdict on everything, the announcement, the restructuring, the dawn meeting, the silence, didn't arrive through another royal statement. It arrived when the family stepped forward publicly for the first time under the new order. Charles appeared as sovereign, alone in the space that Camilla had once occupied beside him. The empty place carried a weight that everyone in the room felt but no one acknowledged. Cameras found it immediately, that gap beside the king where a queen consort had once stood, and held on it long enough for the entire country to feel its meaning. William and Catherine followed, composed, careful, aware of every camera angle and every symbolic implication of where they stood. Anne took her position as guardian of duty, unreadable as always, and Camilla watched from a private room. No ceremonial insignia, no public role, no place in the procession she had once been promised. When Catherine took the position Camilla had occupied, the queen consort felt, by all accounts, the finality of that moment, in a way no formal document had managed to convey. Her life with Charles would continue, but their shared reign was over. After the service, Anne stood near her brother without speaking. Her presence said what no words needed to. He had chosen duty. He had paid the price public approval could never repay. The crown had been stabilized, the marriage had been permanently altered, and the family that emerged from that ceremony was a different family from the one that had entered it, older in some fundamental way, carrying a weight that no future occasion would entirely lift. And then Charles returned to the private apartments where Camilla was waiting. No officials, no restoration discussed. He sat beside her, and she took his hand. So what does all of this actually mean? It means that the British monarchy has just demonstrated, brutally, publicly, and without apology, that the crown operates by a logic that personal love cannot override, that succession, institutional continuity, and the protection of future authority will always outrank the feelings of the people inside the palace walls, even the feelings of the king himself. Charles loved Camilla enough to wait 30 years for her. He defended her when the country despised her. He placed a crown on her head when most people thought it would never happen. And then, when duty demanded it, he took it away. Camilla gave everything to earn a place in that story. She survived the hatred. She outlasted the hostility. She became queen and held that title long enough to understand what it really meant. And what it meant in the end was that it was never fully hers to keep. Their love endures, but her reign is over, and the monarchy moves forward, changed, steadied, and carrying a wound that no declaration, however formal, can fully close. The crown has spoken. History will decide whether it was worth the cost. If this story struck something in you, if you've been thinking about the line between love and duty, between survival and sacrifice, drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me who you think was right. Tell me whether Charles had a choice. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this story. Because one thing this family has proven, again and again, is that it is never truly over. We'll see you in the next one.